Hey, welcome back to the Wednesday night Bible study. We're in installment number 11 of the story of David. And we're in 2 Samuel chapter 6 today. I'm calling this one Do It God's Way. Last week, as you recall, David became king over all Israel. And we ended in 2 Samuel chapter 5 with David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the city of David, or the city of Jerusalem. He built up the area around it from the supporting terraces inward, and he became more and more powerful because the Lord God Almighty was with him. So the Lord God Almighty was with him. So if we were to list the attributes of David, what might we come up with? Well, that he was a leader. He was a poet. He wrote many of the Psalms. He had military prowess. We've seen that already. And he had the attribute that he was a man after God's own heart. Another attribute of David's we can get from many of his Psalms he wrote. For instance, in Psalm 63 verse 1, he wrote to God, "My soul thirsts for you. My body longs for you." And in Psalm 63 verse 8, "My soul clings to you." So another attribute I'd suggest is that David loved God with all his heart and all his soul. Now that he was king, he wanted to express his love and devotion to the fullest. David wanted to set the worship of God as the cornerstone of his government. So an important task, David thought, was to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. That's also called the Ark of God, or the Ark of Covenant, of the Covenant. He wanted to bring it home. So where had it been? We can read in 1 Samuel chapters 4 through 7 the story that tells us where it was. Long ago, it had resided in the tabernacle at Shiloh. Eli, the high priest, and his sons were in charge of it. But in a battle against the Philistines, they captured it. The Philistines took it to a few of their cities with the same result, that people died or got tumors. Quote, "The Lord's hand was heavy on them." After 7 months of this with the Philistines, what do you guess they did? The leaders decided to do. They decided to return the ark to Israel. And they sent it to a town called Beth Shemesh. And it eventually ended up in the house of Abinadab at Kiriath Jearim. It stayed there for 20 years, untouched and completely forgotten. So this was the ark. Been there for 20 years. David wanted to bring it to the capital of Jerusalem. So starting in chapter 6, we see David again brought together out of Israel chosen men, 30,000 in all. He and all his men set out from Baalah of Judah to bring it up from there, the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim that are on the ark. So this was a big deal. Big enough David wanted 30,000 men involved. They set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart with the ark of God on it, and Ahio was walking in front of it. So nothing but the best for God. Specifically, notice a new cart is used. They even specified that. David and the whole house of Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord, with songs and with harps, lyres, tambourines, sistrums, and cymbals. This was truly a big deal, a huge celebration. Surely God was smiling at all this. But let's read on. In verse 6, when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. This doesn't seem right, does it? Why would God do this? Before we explore that, let's see how David reacted. In verse 8. Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day that place is called Perez Uzzah. David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, "How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me?" He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. So David was both angry at God and afraid of him. Something had gone seriously wrong with his good intentions. Well, let's go back and look at some things. What was the ark? Exodus chapter 25 describes it. The ark was a chest made of acacia wood, gold-plated inside and out, and rimmed with a border of gold. It was 3 3/4 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, and 2.25 feet high. Its pure gold lid, the mercy seat, was the base for 2 cherubs, those would be little angels, of hammered gold, with wings outstretched and touching over the cover. Gold rings were fixed at the corners of both long sides of the ark, and gold-plated poles were slipped through the rings. Does anyone recall what was in the ark? From Hebrews chapter 9, verse 4, it included a golden jar containing manna, the manna that was fed the folks as they were traipsing through the desert for so many years, Aaron's rod, and the 10 Commandments. Now, those of you who watched, what was that? Oh gosh, I can't think of the name of it. The movie that involved the ark. Indiana Jones, yeah, that was the ark there. Okay, the ark was holy. God didn't want it hauled around like any old piece of furniture. It had to be handled with reverence and fear. The poles were there to carry the ark without being touched. God had laid out specific rules who could carry the ark. As it was spelled out in Deuteronomy, only the Levite priests from the tribe of Levi could transport the ark. So these things were not being followed. What happened next? It wasn't carried with poles on the shoulders of the Levite priests, for one. Instead, it bumped around on a cart. Uzzah, he was not only not a Levite, but he touched the ark. He had good intentions, but he desecrated its holiness. It cost him his life. David's intention was good, but David had overlooked God's law. David was frustrated, humiliated, disappointed, angry, but it wasn't David's anger at God that God refused to act according to David's plan. So it wasn't David's anger at God that God refused to act according to David, what he wanted to do. That's what I mean. God is God. He can't be worshipped in a way that violates his holiness. We must come to him on his terms, not ours. We must bend our wills to him, not try to bend his will to ours. Is that what David was doing? Obedience is important. No matter how much we desire to do the right thing, if we do it the wrong way, we dishonor God. Doing all of God's will didn't come naturally for David, just as it doesn't for us. When it comes to obeying God, it's often in the details. In this case, in the rings and the poles that can get us. Maybe we don't want to go to the trouble of getting the poles, or we get the poles but don't want to carry them on our shoulders. Hey, there's a cart. Let's just grab it. Let's rewrite the rules. Let's do it our way. It's doubtful that when we disobey God's will, he'll strike us dead, as he did in this case. But we have desecrated his holiness. So the celebration was over. David stored the ark at the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, and the story is not over. In 2 Samuel now, chapter 6, verse 11, the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. Now King David was told, "The Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has because of the ark of God." So David went down and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. This time, David did it the right way. And that's where I bring in First Chronicles. First Chronicles is kind of like a companion or a parallel story of what's going on here with David. So let me back up there. That's why I have this. I don't know what happened to those other two verses. Starting with verse 11 of First Chronicles chapter 15. This is how he did it this time. Then David summoned Zadok and Abiathar, the priests. So now we're dealing with priests. And Uriel, Isaiah, Joel, Shemaiah, Eliel, and Aminadab, the Levites, Levite priests. He said to them, "You are the heads of the Levitical families. You and your fellow Levites are to consecrate yourselves and bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel, to the place I have prepared for it." So David did his homework. He discovered the proper way to transport the ark. It was because you, the Levites, did not bring it up the first time that the Lord our God broke out in anger against us. We did not inquire of him about how to do it in the prescribed way. So the priests and Levites consecrated themselves in order to bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel. And the Levites carried the ark of God with the poles on their shoulders. They did it the right way, never touching the ark, as Moses had commanded in accordance with the word of the Lord. This is the way God had intended and decreed. So now back to 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 13. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. David, wearing a linen ephod, danced before the Lord with all his might, while he and the entire house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets. So what do you see here? Sacrificing, music, dancing. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. So all was going well. It was all good except for the reaction of Michal. We'll talk about that in a minute. Let's read more of the celebration in verse 17. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women. And all the people went to their homes. A very joyous occasion. Would have been great to have been there, wouldn't it? David was on top of the moon. But then there was this one wet blanket, and it was his own wife. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, disrobing in the sight of the slave girls of his servants as any vulgar fellow would." So Michal seemed to be concerned with more than her husband being too expressive. It wasn't that he was dancing and being expressive. She was reflecting a fear of what others might think rather than a fear of the Lord. Would you say she was being preoccupied with image? It was one of the problems, remember, that her father, King Saul, had. Image was one of his problems. So David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor." Michal's words didn't sink any of David's joy, did they? David cared about God's opinion more than hers or anyone's. There's one more verse in this chapter, in this story. We could easily just overlook it, but this add-on, and Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. This seems anticlimactic to a wonderful event. In my studying why the author thought this was important to tack on, 3 possible reasons come up, and you can choose. One is that it's saying that she, Michal, was judged for her attitude. She had no children, being the judgment. Or Another possibility, the fact that her father, the king, had put so much value on image, was this the way to keep this attitude from spreading from Saul through her children? Or possibly is this pointing out that the house of Saul would never possibly have a claim to the throne? She is related to King Saul. By not having children, then King Saul's whole dynasty is ended. Well, I'd like to leave the story about the ark and David's excitement with these thoughts. The more you know you are following God's will, or obeying Him, the freer you can be. David was very free in his celebration. The freer you are before the Lord, the more confident you will become. He was very confident. And the more you know, and the freer you are, the easier it is to dance before Him in pure worship. So I'll leave you with that. We will continue with David's story next week. In the meantime, be safe, and may the Lord be with you.